Okay, there we go. I want to talk this morning about a what is a very challenging part of the human journey, an inescapable but challenging part, and that is working with grief. And some of you know I volunteer and facilitate a bereavement group at our local hospice for it's called Remembering Our Children. It's for parents that have lost a child. And recently, a new member of our group, which meets regularly, was the mother of one of the young men that was shot and murdered in Charlottesville in February. And her grief was just so palpable and overwhelming. And so it just got me thinking that we needed to revisit this topic just because it's just, we never know when we're going to get hit with an experience that provokes a grief response. And talk about the ways in which the Buddha's teachings guide us in dealing with grief, because none of us are going to escape it, as I said. And I'll tell you that the most in all my years professionally of working with folks, the most profound grief, and this will probably not come as a surprise, is that of parents who have lost a child. It's just hard to imagine the depth of the pain and sorrow that evokes. I mean, you know, in a just world, we're never supposed to lose our children. You know, they're never supposed to go before us. And but the beauty of this group is how these folks, you know, everybody in there, from my most senior person has been with us 7 years, and then the most recent person I just mentioned, but how they come together and care for each other and grieve together. I always say to them, and I've probably said to you, that grieving is not something that it should be done alone. It's just too intense and too challenging. So anyway, what does the Buddha Dharma teach us about dealing with grief from losing someone we love? You know, all of us experience this in our lives sooner or later. It's unavoidable. Whether it's a friend, whether it's a family member, a mate, a pet, folks we admire, folks that sort of mark our time in history. All of these things can evoke grief to varying degrees. This is a quote from Anne Lamott, the author. She says, quote, "You will lose someone you can't live without, and your heart will be badly broken. And the bad news is that you will never completely get over the loss of your beloved. But this is also the good news. They live forever in your broken heart that doesn't seal back up, and you come through. It's like having a broken leg that never heals perfectly, that still hurts when the weather gets cold, but you learn to dance with a limp." Close quotes. You know, and we talk about uncertainty here, and death and loss is sort of the ultimate uncertainty in our path in our human lives. You know, we don't know when or how it's going to hit us, but we just know that it is sooner or later. So do we deny that? Do we sort of push it aside, the possibility of loss, until we're blindsided by it? I think too often that's the case. Or do we maintain an awareness of it to remind us to live every day fully, to love those around us every day fully, to cherish the time we spend with them? You know, the Buddha talked a lot about this. You know, there's so many practices in Buddhist tradition of sort of acknowledging death as a way of really inspiring us to live our lives fully, mindfully, and be fully present. I would also suggest, based upon my experience with my group, but also in my own life, that if we let it, grief opens our hearts. It deepens our compassion to ourselves and others. This is from Michael Stone, who's a Buddhist teacher from Vancouver. He actually died several years ago, but he said, quote, "If grief is deep and imponderable, it is because love is deep and imponderable too. The world presents us with opportunities for connection, but the flip side of these is the impermanence of these opportunities. The Buddha taught that at bottom, the more we love that which we lose, the more grief we feel. The world is living and dying, full of birth and loss, tragedy and change. It is the first truth, the first noble truth that runs like a tragic thread through all of our lives." You know, when as small children, when we first become aware of death and loss, it's confusing. You know, pre-age school children, when you talk to them, you know, they begin to understand that many adults fear death, but they sometimes see it as as reversible. I'm sorry. It's sort of like in cartoons, you know, when Wile E. Coyote falls off the cliff, he bounces back. You know, he's not gone. And often we say to young children who experience a loss that so-and-so went to heaven, you know, sort of to give them some sense that there's no finality to that loss. You know, most children in this preschool group don't understand that death is permanent, that everyone and every living thing eventually will die, and that it's just part of the human journey. And so this is sort of the early experience, at least in Western culture, around our conditioning with death. You know, and we do a terrible job in the West with this. We sanitize death and how we talk about it, or not talk about it for that matter, how we grieve, how we distance from the person who just died. You know, folks in my group often say, you know, that there's all this hubbub until the last covered dish is eaten, and then they just feel so alone because everybody goes back to their own lives. You know, and as we get older, you know, often denial becomes the primary way of avoiding thinking about death. But how do we live fully if we don't accept the inevitability of it? How do we live fully in the moment every day with gratitude for every day as a gift? You know, contemplating the death of those we love and feeling tremendous grief in the aftermath, you know, brings us face to face with what really matters, with what life is all about. It shows us that to be human is to be vulnerable, to suffer, and to risk loving. This is from a book called Bearing the Unbearable by Joan Cacciatore. She says, quote, "We might never accept that our child or parent or spouse or grandchild or friend or loved one has died, but we can learn to accept how we feel about the loss. Where in us is the pain most acute, its dimensions and texture, its tenor and depth. And over time, grief can morph from a dreaded, unwanted intruder to something more familiar and less terrifying, even a companion, perhaps. Make no mistake, losing someone we love deeply changes us inescapably and for all time. And it is painful beyond all imagining. The late psychologist Rollo May wrote, 'One does not become fully human painlessly. One does not become fully human painlessly. It is through inhabiting, often painfully, our emotions that we become more fully human. Through grief, we experience an alchemical transformation that cannot be contrived, hastened, or imparted by others,' close quotes. So in reflecting on today, I was reflecting that in the past 10 years, I lost my father, two of my best male friends, one of my oldest and dearest female friends, my mother, and one of my beloved golden retrievers. In each case, my initial inclination, my default, was to push it away. I was confused, I was hurt, I was sorrowful, I just didn't want to feel it. I wanted to just find a way to escape. And someone said in my group the other night that, you know, as soon as their loss happened, they just threw themselves into activity until they just were so exhausted that it came back and bit them. You know, it finally hit them when they slowed down. And that was how I felt. I didn't want to face any of these losses, especially as they accumulated. You know, I just felt like the weight of it was going to crush me. You know, it was more sorrow than I felt I could shoulder. But the paradox here is that it also opened my heart. You know, loss strips away our protective armor, whether we want it to or not. And that's what happened to me. You know, as I opened to that experience, you know, as I leaned into it rather than trying to avoid it, as I relaxed more into the stream of my loss, there was a lightening there. I mean, it was very paradoxical. I was very, very sad. I still felt grief. But I also experienced this sort of strange kind of freedom of being able to be with what was despite the pain of it. And it was really a lesson for me on this path. You know, facing that which we want to turn away from with compassion for ourselves without judgment is really an opening. We don't become judgmental about our loss. We don't try to control it. We lean toward it with compassion and acceptance, as we do with all experience. I mean, I know that's a familiar refrain. This is from Lao Tzu, who was the Taoist teacher in China. He says, quote, "Life is a series of natural and spontaneous changes. Don't resist them. That only creates sorrow. Let reality be reality. Let things flow naturally forward in whatever way they like," close quotes. So let me stop there, and let's reflect on this together, because it's really a powerful
Yeah,
experience.